Hi, everybody. I'm Mr. Yeoman, and today we are taking a look at the evidence for evolutionary theory. The first that we need to address in talking about evolutionary theory is really what is a scientific theory. I think there's a lot of misconception about what that means. And really, what that comes down to is that a scientific theory is just a well explained explanation aspect of the natural world that we're able to come to using the scientific method. So we talked about the scientific method way back at the beginning of this class. It's one of the first things that we learn, and we continue to use that over and over and over again. So collecting data and being able to show that evidence through those collections of data. It's also repeatedly tested and confirmed, so it's not just a one and done, oh, we did it, now it's proven. We're going to keep testing that over and over again. And so that's what I think one of the misconceptions about evolutionary theory is that it's not continuously being tested. It is. And really that makes it better. It might change our understanding of how evolution works. But overall, those continual tests and explanations give us a better understanding of the way that the natural world works. And so just as a review, some examples of other scientific theories are gravity, germ theory, plate tectonics, cell theory, so the idea that all living things are made out of cells, and then the theory of relativity. All of these have been shown to accurately demonstrate the way that the world works over and over and over again in these lab settings and out in nature. So just again, as a little bit of a reminder of what we mean by a theory when we talk about evolutionary theory. So there are different ways to break this up into what this evidence means and how this looks. We tend to use, at least in our school, we tend to use the acronym FAME. Okay, and so that acronym FAME stands for Fossils, Anatomy, Molecules, and Embryology. So going back to this first one, fossils. Fossils are our best evidence of all the living things that used to be on Earth that are no longer here. So you've probably heard that that number of 99% of all of the living things that have ever been on Earth are now extinct. That's true. A lot of the organisms that have been on Earth have since gone extinct. And so we can't really test those on a day-to-day basis because we don't have those animals around anymore. So our only way to really look to see how did those organisms behave or what were their structures is to look at those fossils. Granted, that's a little bit limited, especially considering that the major types of structures that end up being preserved in fossils are bones. So that leaves a lot of things that are a little bit of guesswork, but it still gives us a good idea of what those living things, what their bone structures were like, at least at a minimum. And then there are some other things that we can kind of conclude, their proximity to their eggs. So did they just leave their nests? Did they sit on their eggs, which is part of the reason that we know that at least some dinosaurs are warm-blooded. So there's all these things that we can get from fossils, but some of them are more direct than others. And these tend to form in sedimentary rock because that layering of the soil, ash, whatever it happens to be, those layers end up preserving those rocks really, really well. Those aren't the only types of fossils that exist, but those are the big ones. Also keep in mind fossils could be imprints as well. So if you have an imprinting of an egg, an imprint of a footprint, those are still fossils as well. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward one that I think most of us are familiar with. The second one is looking at anatomy. There's really a lot of things that fall under this category. But in general, when we're talking about evidence for evolution, we're including anatomy in that, we're looking at comparison of different structures. And so the first one that I usually begin with is homologous structures. So the prefix homo means the same. The homologous structures are structures that are the same in different organisms. And so those common structures tend to indicate that those organisms have a shared ancestry. So here I have some different bones of different vertebrates. These are all mammals. So we have a human arm, a horse's leg, and a bat's wing. And if we take a look at it, there's some variation in there, but all the bones are still there. You still have, a single bone up at the top here, two bones further down, and then lots of little bones down here at the end. The horse is probably the most modified in this case to have that single bone that's really just like standing on a toe. But when we put that with fossil evidence, we see that horses used to have more than a single toe. So all these things kind of start to fit together. And so they have the same structures, but they use them for different functions. So the human arm is really a very generalized structure. We can do a lot of different things. We can't do anything with it really, really well. There's not a single job that it does really, really well. Horses, they have a single job. They can run really, really fast. Their limbs are modified to be able to carry them very, very quickly, but they can't do a whole lot of anything else with it. Bats, on the other hand, if you really look at those bones, they look like human hand bones. They're just stretched out really, really far. So you have that thumb sitting up there at the top, and then those finger bones are sort of stretched out. The arm bones really are very similar. You have that one humerus, that bigger upper arm bone, and then you have the two bones down at the bottom, so that ulna allows you to bend it back and forth, whereas the radius allows you to rotate it. And so that's going to be important for flying as well, to get some of that flexibility and maneuverability in flight. So you have a lot of these common structures, but they're using them for different functions. So we call that divergent evolution, from that diverging that they are splitting off. So again, this indicates that there was some common ancestry, but they have changed as their needs have changed as well. Okay, the second structure that we'll take a look at here are vestigial structures. And vestigial structures are structures that are either reduced in size or used for a different purpose. And so one of my favorite examples is the blind cavefish. There are plenty of others, and we could talk about some of them that are just in humans. In class, we have discussed the appendix as well as those erector pili that give you goosebumps and wisdom teeth. So there's all these different structures that are sort of leftovers. But one of my favorites is the blind cavefish, because this is a fish that lives in complete darkness. They live in like the cenotes in Central America. And there's really no need to have eyes because they're really a risk. They could lead to infection, so having those eyes. So the eye sockets are still there, but the actual eyes themselves are just kind of overgrown, so they just have skin there because there's no benefit to having vision, and there's only possible drawbacks to it. And so that's just another example of a vestigial structure. Again, it's one of my favorite ones, especially when you start looking at some of these other pieces of evidence. We can see that blind cavefish have evolved independently of one another several different times. So I think that kind of makes that an even more impressive skill or advantage there. All right, as far as the anatomy goes, I have one more that I wanted to discuss. These are analogous structures. And so if you look at that, you can almost see the word analogy in there. So that's comparing two things that are really not related, but you're using them to share a common idea. Okay, so lots of analogies that you could use in your English classes. In this case, we show two organisms that have similar functions, but those similar functions are there because they fill a similar niche. However, their structures are entirely different. And so over here, sorry, this is not one of my greatest pictures, but I have a dolphin and a shark. Take my word for it. That's a dolphin and a shark, so sorry about it. But dolphins and sharks are not closely related. Okay, sharks are a type of cartilaginous fish. They have gills. They don't have lungs. Whereas dolphins, they are mammals. They give live birth. They nurse their young. So there's all of these differences. But when you look at them, they have very similar body shapes. But that's because they're both aquatic predators. And so they fill a very similar niche. But one of the things that I think really shows the difference between them is the motion. When you look at a dolphin's tail, its tail goes up and down. Okay, so kind of like if you imagine you're swimming, your legs generally will go up and down in that motion. That's a more natural motion for us. Whereas the shark, its spine will curve in the opposite direction. So its tail will go from side to side. So just some differences. They're using them in very similar ways, but they have totally different structures. And so that indicates to us that they do not have common ancestry. So we call that convergent evolution, where they're coming from different ancestors, but they are converging into having a common body shape or a common function. All right. Next one are molecules. Okay, so there's lots of different molecules. This is more of a recent category for us to look at, just because the whole idea of DNA and proteins and how those work is in relationship to all these other pieces of evidence is a fairly recent discovery. Okay, so keep in mind, like the structure of DNA wasn't known until halfway through the last century. And then understanding, exactly how DNA ends up getting converted into proteins. That whole process wasn't really well known until a little bit later on. And so what we look at here are the common genes and the common proteins. Now that we can actually see the order of the DNA, we can look at the order of the amino acids and the proteins. We can use those sequences to determine how those structures developed, but more than that, whether or not they share a common ancestry. The chances that you would have two exact proteins that end up having the exact same amino acid developing completely by chance is unlikely. However, if they shared a common ancestor, that would be a much better explanation compared to just saying, oh, they just randomly both ended up developing the exact same protein. So that is another example that has come around recently. And so you look at those proteins and look at those segments of DNA and compare those and see how similar they are between organisms. All right, last one, embryology. And like I said, some of these end up getting categorized differently. And embryology is one that I usually put along with anatomy, but that kind of messes up our acronym there, our FAME acronym. So, but it is worth it that there are certain homologous structures that could only be seen in that embryonic stage. And so one of those examples would be tails. All vertebrates have tails at some point during their development. So humans have tails during embryonic development. Now those will go away eventually, and all other apes also have tails, which will end up being removed from the organism. But they are there for a period of time during embryonic development. Another example are the gill arches. In fish, those gill arches turn into those protective bones around their gills, because that's a very sensitive part of the fish. Now, we don't have gills, but as an embryo, all other vertebrates also have these gill arches. And they get turned into other structures such as parts of the throat, so the thyroid gland, the jaw is a leftover gill arch, and even parts of our inner ear and part of your outer ear. So those are all parts of later vertebrates that are not part of these early vertebrates. And so those structures have sort of been hijacked and been used for something else, which also kind of makes it a vestigial structure in a way. Okay, so these are just four of the major pieces of evidence for evolutionary theory. We could spend a lot of time on each one of these. We won't. But just recognize that we're just sort of dipping our toe into this, that we could spend, there are people who spend years studying this and never reach the end. So just be aware of how much information is here. So we're just looking at the tip of it right now. So I hope that helped. And as always, stay curious and seek truth.